Okay, do you want me to be interviewer then? I want to introduce it. Hello everyone. Well, hello Sam, first of all, and hello to everyone who's watching this. Chatting to Sam Anderson of Cane Creek. They've recently released their Tigon shock, which is their new shock. So we're just going to have a quick chat with him today, and Sam can explain some of the science. So I don't know if you just want to give a quick introduction, Sam, and then I've got some questions as we go along. And
yeah, sweet. Yeah, so I've been at Cane Creek. My name's Sam Anderson. I'm in sales now, but I've been 3 or 4 different roles here at Cane Creek for the last 9 years. I've been most recently the brand manager for the last 6 years, and Tigon, the shock that we're going to talk about today, was kind of the last project that I did before I moved across the building. So,
okay.
So Tigon started out actually as a shock that we were going to try to replace our IL platform, our inline shocks, with. The original impetus was to try to push all of the damping and air spring technology to one side of the shock so that we could fit bikes that had seat tube clearance problems. Because when you have a twin tube shock, typically like a Float X2 or like an Öhlins TTX or one of our Kitsuma shocks or our IL shocks have dampers on one side and springs on the other.
Okay.
And so making a twin tube shock that has an air spring on the same side as the damping turned out to be problematic.
So when you say same size, you mean they're running in series, the spring and the damper are running in parallel. Sorry, that's
more the situation, the location of the
so
guts,
physically,
if you will.
Okay.
Yeah. So like if you have an eye-to-eye shock and it's a 230 by 60 as you've got there, right?
Yeah.
One side of the shock's mounted towards the rear end of the bike and the other side's mounted towards the front. So on this shock, the damping and in this case the ramp tube are on the same side of the shock.
Okay, so all the systems, all the mechanics is this end rather than okay.
So the real reason for that was because usually when you have a big air spring, the air can itself is like 52 to 58 millimeters in outer diameter. So doesn't really fit through bikes like a Santa Cruz or a bike like a Pivot or something like that has issues with clearance.
Okay.
Now that was only going to be relevant for an air shock because when you put a coil on it, you're back up to 53, 54 millimeters in OD. So that was kind of the early tech on Tigon, was let's focus on a clearance on one side so we could fit through some of these shocks or some of these frames. What that did though is it forced us to put a lot of the damping technology into an external reservoir. So we were already kind of steering away from what an inline shock was because of the architecture that we were forced to make based on my original motivation to put everything on one side.
Okay.
So we were already deviating from that. Step 2 was, the air shock starts to look a lot like a competitor shock, even though it's a twin tube. We're not necessarily going to be able to market as a small brand why you would want to buy this shock if it looks very similar to something you already have. So the air shock, probably a year into development, was like, we canned it. We were like, this isn't going to work. The coil shock, however, if you can raise that one up again, Joe, the gray part is the ramp tube. And behind the ramp tube is a traditional coil shaft, as you would see on a coil shock. But it's in the middle of the shock instead of it being on the end of the shock where you would traditionally see. Exactly. So there is a shaft similar to that inside. So we were looking at this coil version and we're like, okay, architecturally, it looks unique because the shaft's on the middle of the shock rather than on the outside. And we took that a step further and said, well, coil shocks aren't necessarily great for a lot of frames because of the lateral or the flex that could go into the actual movement of the shock. And so we were like, well, what if we fortify the area because we have the damper tube on one side and a adjuster or a valve body on the other side? We could kind of bridge those two things together. So the ramp tube kind of came from an architectural convenience, if you will.
Okay. So it wasn't your original specification. You've totally deviated just because it offers some benefits.
Yeah.
Okay, that's really
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah. So, it's like, the common phrase of like, you're not really advancing if you're standing still. So we had a plan, and we were kind of executing a certain plan, but because we were moving, we were able to identify better opportunities than the original plan. So, Tigon was kind of an organic, like, we ride these shocks. We are realistic about, making something that people want to buy or should buy. And then when things kind of come to a dead end, we realize it's a dead end and kind of figure out a way out. Right. So the navigation to where we are now is I would say I take a level of pride in that, understanding that not everything that, somebody might come up with is a good idea, and reflecting and understanding that like we were going down a path that wasn't really good for anyone, and then kind of reassessing and replanning and making something that was, I guess, in our opinion, a slam dunk, right? Like having a shock that can do pretty much everything you want it to without having to adjust anything or have a battery on it was kind of like, man, we got something going here,
I like the no battery. That's sort of to me, that's just adding function for the sake of it, isn't it? Rather than proper performance, which is but we shouldn't talk about that too much. Might upset somebody. But no, that's good. Okay, that's really interesting. So, but it's interesting as well about the side load issue as a driver as well. And I'm hearing that so much from other frame manufacturers, just snapping shafts, aren't they? And it's all the shock companies are, and it's not. So I think people say about Starling frames that, it's flexible, therefore it's going to snap shocks. We don't have that at all. Because it's flexible, there's very little load going through the shock. It's generally big, stiff linkages, isn't it, that are causing the failure? Misaligned, massively stiff linkages, your tolerances. So, okay.
Yeah. I mean, typically on a clevis mount bike, right, like the eyelet is on the end of the shock is turned 90 degrees for folks that don't understand what a clevis might mean, right? And I think that's important to note, right? So in a Starling frame, of course, you guys have the eyelets parallel together, and that allows the design of a DU bushing to rotate. And that's what a shock is intended to do, right? A lot of frames these days have a mounting that's traditional on the front, and then instead of it being parallel in the rear, they turn it 90 degrees so that they can actually, in my opinion, it's more about going around a seat tube. You need a linkage to access the shock. You can't really do that if it's buckling like this, especially if you have a pivot. So it's basically a design that's a forced design for people that are trying to keep leverage ratios in a certain way.
They're trying to keep the clevis in line, so they're actually stopping the clevis from buckling like this by changing.
So when you have micro differences between, when you have a lot of travel and you have a clevis that's longer and longer and longer, the chance of something getting misaligned or the chance of something actually rotating against the way that the shock wants to move is what causes failure ultimately.
Or even where in the bush will just put a small kink in it, won't it, and stuff.
Right. So sometimes air shocks, they have a lot more things that are sleeved together, and it creates more structure. On a coil shock, when you just have a 8 to 10 millimeter shaft, that's the only thing keeping the shock from breaking in half on some of those bikes that are problematic. Now, there's a lot of frames that are coming out these days that are clevis that have quite a bit more precision in their alignment. Their leverage ratio is, in a way, safer for that type of movement. But it gets into a dangerous place when you're turning the shock in a direction it's not intended to turn.
Okay. But we don't need to worry about that with a Starling.
That's right.
It doesn't do that, but that's really interesting. That's really interesting. So it's the extra diameter of the air shaft that's adding the stiffness, essentially. Okay, but we don't care for a Starling. What we care about for a Starling is that this is a coil shock, and I've on my early bikes I run air shocks because general kind of not. Well, people think you have to run an air shock on a linear bike because you need it to ramp up. And that's what everybody was telling me. But I've always felt with air shocks, there's always a compromise between small bump sensitivity and mid-stroke support. You sort of soften it up and then it blows through the mid-stroke, or you make it firm and then it's harsh. And as good as air shocks get, there's always a compromise with that compared to a coil. So tell me if I'm wrong here, but this is my thinking. Now the coil is essentially suppler off the start because there's no stiction. And because it's suppler, you can effectively run a firmer spring rate than you would on the equivalent air. So it's got the mid-stroke support. Do you agree with that? Or
yeah, I'd say that there's a level of, increasing your spring rate is almost a compromise on the opposite side, though, right? So like on a coil shock, you're right, it does have less stiction because there are fewer things sealing the shock.
Yeah.
You just have an oil seal head on the end of the shock, and that's pretty much the only thing that you have to overcome in terms of friction. On an air shock, you've got an air wiper seal on the outside of the air can. You've got an inner air can wiper seal, and you have an oil seal head. So there's basically 3 times the amount of stiction on an air shock. Now, an air shock will counterbalance some of that with a negative air spring, right? So a coil shock doesn't have a negative coil, or a traditional one doesn't. This one does. So to answer your original question, a coil shock typically feels better on roots and rocks that are relatively small. And so when you flutter across the trail, the coil shock's just going to give you better traction. There's no doubt about it. Yeah. Now, on the other end,
and to agree on the mid, because I've felt the coil's always given me better mid-stroke support as well. And to me, that's really key. The bike stays in the right shape. And
yeah, that is good. That's a good point too. Coil shock is linear unless you have a progressive spring, which is in a sense linear too, just as a nick point. On an air shock, because of the negative air chamber, the graph, and I guess I'm pointing this direction, I don't know if this is the graph kind of bows. So on a linear spring, it's a linear turn, and an air shock kind of does this. So yes, the mid-stroke typically is more consistent, more linear, and has more support on a coil shock. But of course, once you get past 60% of your stroke, then you start to see the downside of a traditional coil shock, right? Yeah. Where that linear nature of the spring rate starts to kind of actually turn into a negative.
That's bottom out performance. So as we're hitting the end stroke, the coil will just keep moving at the same rate, whereas an air spring should ramp up and have a soft. So I suppose that's where your shock is coming in, isn't it? This is where you think you're doing. There's one quick point. Because this air is at such a low pressure, 30 psi, does that mean that the friction is a lot lower than something running at 170, 180 psi?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the pressure is definitely related to how firm the shock is off the top. 30 psi is mainly because of the coil negative spring that I was touching on a second ago that this shock has that other coil shocks don't. A standard coil shock is just a damper, and you have a coil spring. And so the spring will compress in a positive manner, and then it returns because of the potential energy that you create, and the damper is designed to slow those forces down. On an air shock, you don't just have a positive air chamber, you have a negative air chamber as well, because if you didn't, it would just top out. It would just come right back to the top out. And so there has to be kind of a negative air chamber to counterbalance or slow the shock down as it comes back to full extension. This shock has the same thing. So we don't have a negative air spring in the shock. It's just a positive air spring. So if you were to add more than 30 psi to the shock, it's technically possible. It will hold a lot of air pressure, just like a standard air shock. But the problem is that the shock will start to top out. So you'll be like hitting a jump, and it'll like come out and top out. The 30 psi was calculated by the spring force that we could create with a mechanical internal negative spring. So when the shock has 30 psi in it, there is a little coil spring that's actually trying to extend itself as you're pushing on the shock, and that creates a zero or a balance in off the top pressure. Now 30 psi is not very significant at sag, but because the chamber is so small, it actually ramps up exponentially. So at the end of stroke with 30 psi on a 210 or 185 size Tigon, it has 300 pounds of extra bottom out force. Right. On a 230 or a 205, because the shock's slightly longer and there's more stroke, we can get 350 pounds of end stroke
Wow.
added, right? Now, the progression is related to what the spring rate is. So if you have a small spring rate, 400 or 450, that extra 300 or 350 pounds of force is going to, percentage-wise, create way more progression than, say, a 600-pound spring.
Yeah. Okay.
So just to nerd out real quick, if you're on a 2 1/4 spring rate or 2 1/4 stroke, 400-pound spring rate, a traditional spring would be 900 pounds of end stroke force, right?
Yeah.
2.25 times 400.
Yeah.
If you add 300 pounds to the end stroke, then you're at 1,200 pounds, and the delta difference is 33%.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
on a 400-pound spring on, a bike with 2 1/4, then you could add 30% progression with 30 psi, 33%, I should say. On a 600-pound spring, you're down to 23%. So the difference there, but depending on the spring rate, right?
So we're adjusting the air pressure in this shock to account for different, to get different round rates with different spring weights, essentially.
Yep.
Just something you said back there as well, that because the air chamber is so small, so all the Fox X2s and your kind of inline, or not the inline, your air shock have all got big air cans, haven't they? And that's because they've been pushing towards as linear as possible.
Trying to make coil like,
So it's trying to make an air shock like a coil, but that's why they've got a big air spring means. Is it because you're not going all the way to the end? So it's sort of like you're only compressing it 50% as opposed to a smaller air can where you're compressing it 80%. Is that what causes the ramp up, or is it just does that make sense?
The ramp up on the Tigon?
On an air shock, on a traditional air shock. So the big air can, does that mean that allows you to compress it less as a percentage compared to a smaller air can? Does that make sense?
Yeah. The main reason that you would have a larger air can is to have a larger diameter on your air piston.
Oh, okay. So it's the diameter. Okay.
And the diameter of the air piston directly is correlated with how much air pressure is required to set sag.
Yeah.
So when you have a bike that has a 2-to-1 leverage ratio versus a 3-to-1 leverage ratio, and I'm sure, as you know, Joe, with designs these days, more progression or more leverage creates more travel out of less stroke on the shock. So when companies were coming out with bikes in the last couple of years, the leverage ratios kind of came up. And so the requirement for a 200-pound rider, and I'm using imperial, I should probably switch to metric.
It's all right. I'll get Jamie to put some text underneath for everyone.
Sweet. Well, either way, right? The heavier the rider, the more pressure you're going to need to set sag, right? And when a bike has a leverage ratio that's, I would say, higher than it needs to be, 3.5 is not really that uncommon, but those types of riders can't run a coil shock because they would be up to like an 800-pound spring, right? So the diameter of the air can is more related to the requirements that frames are putting on shocks. It's more about can you run, and a maximum air pressure on a Kitsuma shock is 350 psi, right? So if you are 250 pounds on a bike that is a really high leverage ratio, you're going to get pretty dang close to the maximum air pressure on that shock. On a smaller air can, like a Fox Float X, for example, that air can is directly related to how small the diameter of that air piston is. And that air pressure requirement is going to be 40% higher than a Float X2, for example, because of the diameter of that air piston. So it's a double-edged sword. It's like, well, do you want a high leverage bike with a small, tiny area for the shock to actually be installed on the frame? Okay, well, something's going to have to give. We're going to have to make either an 800-pound coil spring or an air can that requires a diameter air piston that's something like 48 or something, or bigger, right?
So they've kind of kept that quiet, haven't they? So my simple brain kind of remembers back to the old Foes bikes that were, their selling point was a 2-to-1.
Yeah, I remember the
ratio.
Kernut shocks. Yeah.
Massive things, and I suppose frames now want to try and squeeze a bottle in. It's probably what's driving a lot of it. So yeah, and they're trying to hide the shock out the way. So you're saying that's driven really high leverage ratios, but nobody's really talked about that, have they? It's kind of kept quiet. But yeah, that's interesting.
And I guess like that's, now that I'm talking about it a little bit more, like if you're in the right spring rate for the coil shock, and you can fit the right spring to set sag on a shock like this, then the progression for a leverage ratio bike that's going from 3.5 to 2, that's a huge level of progression. Some bikes don't have that, right? I mean, as you guys probably have 15 to 25%.
No, it's pretty much linear. It's almost perfectly linear. Yeah.
And
it's tiny change.
Yeah. So that, but like, I've always like searched for like, what's like the ratio? What's the balance of like, how much progression do you really need? Right. And I guess I've kind of done like an average of like what the frame does and what the shock does. Right. We calculated on the progressive spring that 18% progression is what an Air IL could do from 0 to bottom with 1 volume band installed. Okay. So the shock itself has about an 18 to 20% progression. Okay. So sometimes a bike will have about that 25 or 30%. Like the Norco Range, the new one is like, you don't want to run an air shock on that bike because it's so progressive.
Yeah.
Now, the frame and the shock are two things that blend together to create a perfect amount of progression. Yeah. And to me, after doing this for a long time, it seems that like 20 to 30% is kind of like the sweet spot to have in terms of the entire system providing a certain bottom out support.
But does that depend what kind of rider you are? So I always feel if you're riding natural terrain and you're after grip, less progression is better because you can aim for that more mid-stroke support, keep your bike more balanced. Whereas if you're hitting big hits, you kind of need more progression, don't you, to keep stop you blowing through. So,
which is why having a shock that you can adjust the amount of progression on is kind of the point of that.
Yeah, right? Yeah.
Totally. Like, you guys aren't far from Bike Park Wales, right? Probably like an hour and a half or so, right?
Yeah.
If you're at your local park and it's like mostly roots and rocks and you're staying on the ground, take the air out of the shock and use all the travel. And then when you get on the uplift and you're hitting jumps, like, add 30 PSI and you're gonna have that support, right? So that was kind of the reasoning too of allowing that adjustability to be on the shock. Because sometimes you can add a progression flip switch on frames. I've seen a lot of those chips that you can adjust, and those things change as well, the sag and some other details, bottom bracket height. So it's not an exact like progression add. There's other things going on. So yet another reason to, plug and play on a shock like this, right?
Yeah. So is there a bit as well? I've always thought a linear, whenever I've spoken to suspension tuners, give them a linear leverage ratio and they're very happy. They know exactly how to set up the shims. It's really simple for them, so they can get the best performance out. The bikes that are super progressive, you first of all have issues with getting the right spring rates, but you quite often have it ramps up so quickly. You're not using the full amount of travel, and it's so soft at the start. Your bike is sort of jumping down and then firming up. It's not, your brain can't understand it, and I think that's key, isn't it? If your brain can understand how the back end is working. So I kind of feel this Tigon on a linear frame allows you to achieve everything, doesn't it? You get what you want. And
totally.
I've got a few questions for you. You've kind of answered a lot of them, actually. Let's see, I think you probably answered all of them. Okay, one about coil shocks, actually. Preloads on coil shocks.
Yeah.
So tell me about it. You shouldn't run any, is my understanding, because it's just adding to the initial bump force you've got to achieve. But tell me about that.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think preload is something people overlook. So let's deep dive. Okay. So preload is, in my opinion, and I think a lot of others, only used to achieve the right sag point. It shouldn't be used as a tuning feature like adding air to a shock, unless adding air to the shock is sag related, right? Okay. So like preload as to your point, is when you compress a shock, it is adding the initial force required to compress the shock.
Yeah.
I always like to use the 10% rule. So let's go back to a 500-pound spring, for example. And to do a measurement of the spring itself, the 500-pound marking on the shock means that it takes 500 pounds of force to compress the spring 1 inch.
Yeah.
Right. If the spring has 3 inches of stroke, then the end stroke is 1,500 pounds to bottom that spring out. Right. Preload is just a micro adjustment to get you going into the spring rate. So if you are on a 2.5 to 1 leverage ratio bike and you're some random number like 180 pounds or something, right? Just doing a quick math here. You would land perfectly at 450 pounds.
Yeah.
You would use a 450-pound spring with minimal preload.
Yeah.
But if you weighed 190 pounds and you had the same bike, you'd be at 475 pounds spring rate. You're right in between the two springs, right? In order to do the correct amount of sag, you would have to increase the preload on the spring to get you to that exact starting point of 475 pounds, right? So a quick add on math for me, I was going back to the 10% rule. This will be a imperial metric help. 25.4 millimeters is 1 inch.
Yeah.
Right. All of the threads on coil shocks have a 1 millimeter thread pitch.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
So that means that 2.5 turns of preload is equated to 10% of the spring rate.
Yeah.
So if you're on a 500-pound spring and you put 2.5 turns of preload on it, that means that the spring is now at 550 pounds because you're adding 10% of the spring rate back when you twist it 2.5 times. So I always use that as like a cross multiplier. If I need 25 pounds and it's a 500-pound spring, then I would do 1.75 pounds, right? Or sorry, doing it again. 1.2 turns of preload is going to give me 25 pounds, right? So back to your original question of what is preload? Preload is only supposed to be used to get you to that exact sag point. And if you're, too deep in sag, then you add preload to get to that point where you're measuring perfectly at whatever sag point you want on a certain bike.
Okay. So that's slightly different to my understanding was, I suppose the difference is with the spring, if you add preloads, then you need to exceed that force. So say you've added 100 pounds of spring force by preload, until that bump is 100 pounds force, the spring won't start moving. But where that's wrong is that you're sat at sag, aren't you? So at sag, the spring is kind of moving freely already. You've exceeded that. It's only when you're going from 0% travel that you've got to overcome that. So it kind of doesn't matter. It's all moving freely by the time you get to the middle. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I guess like it would affect your initial stroke, right? It would, like if you create a 550-pound spring, the sag point is, at 1 inch, 2.5 turns, right? So like 10% of the spring rate at an inch is going to be 550 pounds. So typically I'm always measuring at sag though. So like to your point, there is an additional mathematical relationship of, on a 230/65, you're pretty damn close to an inch of stroke, right?
Yeah.
So that would directly correlate. If you're on a tiny like trail bike, like with a 50, it's a 50 millimeter sag or stroke, then that's 50% of the travel to get to that point, right? But the physicality of the spring starting here and moving to here to get to an exact amount, it's just a proportional as like a linear spring would. The more you preload the spring, the more force it's going to take to compress that spring. But it's not increasing the end stroke. It's just kind of skipping a portion of that stroke.
Yeah. So I'd kind of argue a better solution is more spring intervals and less preload.
Yes.
So that's a good question for Cane Creek. Why don't you do 25s?
Yeah. So basically preload is possible up to about 6 turns on each spring. Now, in order for us to have 25-pound increments, there would need to be a little bit more finite kind of standardization of frames, right? Like when you have people that are like, 150 to 200 pounds and they skip like that, it just makes it easier to have a few less springs. But the fact that a spring is actually rated for about 6 millimeters more than the stroke itself means that there's quite a bit of preload tunability between springs. And to my point earlier about adding 2.5 turns on a 550-pound spring, you're already up to on a 500-pound spring, add 2.5 turns and you're up to the next spring rate already.
Yeah.
Right. So that's kind of the reason why we don't do 25 pounds, is because you can achieve the differences between the 50-pound increments pretty easily with preload. Now, if you were on a 300-pound spring and you actually were more like a 370, right? That would take 5 turns of preload to get up to that point. So at that point, you probably want to go up to a 350-pound spring, right? So, however, the springs, as I mentioned, you can go up to 6 turns or 6 millimeters before the spring actually achieves coil bind on its intended stroke.
Okay.
So if you have a 57 millimeter spring stroke, 2.25, same thing. It technically could go up to 63, technically.
Yeah. Okay.
With zero preload.
Yeah.
Right. Now, if you had 6 turns, you probably should be going up in spring rate anyway. But I think, a lot of misconception on the springs, like not, like if you want like the softest, supplest, off the top force, it's still related to your rider weight.
Yeah.
And so having 25-pound increments on springs, it's just extra skews where we could use preload to our advantage in that point.
Okay. All right. What else have I got here? There's quite a nice, I kind of noticed, where's it gone? You've got a little spring clip that sits in the threads. That's just to stop the spring winding back off?
Yeah, and actually it's supposed to go in the groove further down, but that is actually a good way to use it, right? Because then you can force it to keep it in the same spot. The reason it's on there to begin with, though, is that a traditional coil shock's preload adjuster is on the body of the shock, and then you have a spring clip, and the preload adjuster and the spring clip are one and the same on the Tigon.
Okay.
We don't want the preload collar to fall off the shock, because then it'll be a problem.
So it shouldn't. I've put it in the wrong place.
But that's a clever. I'm going to try it on my shock and see if it actually works.
So it does. Does it stop it? It does. No, it doesn't stop it. Okay. So it's a clever idea. That doesn't work. So it should be in that groove there, and it's just to stop in. Okay. And
it's a fail safe essentially, more than it is.
Okay. I see. Okay. Now to use it. Okay, I think that's all my questions really. I suppose really tell me why I should use this on my bikes. Tell me, is this is sort of the golden ticket, isn't it? For a linear leverage ratio, it's the golden ticket. We get spring performance. Nobody can complain that springs it's not going to ramp up at the ends and get harsh bottom out.
Yeah. I mean, you nailed it, right? It's like it's got the first bit of stroke is going to feel like a coil shock. And as soon as you get past 60% of the stroke, it's going to start to feel more like an air shock. And so you have kind of both of those dynamic spring rates in one without having to adjust anything, right? And of course, the shock is a twin tube damper, like you're familiar with all Cane Creek shocks, double barrel technology, as we call it. So the oil is moving in a cyclical motion for folks that don't know what a twin tube shock is. And that allows us to tune rebound and compression independently rather than having a main piston. This shock does, however, have high-speed rebound internalized, right? So on all of our other shocks, there's 4 adjustments that you can either turn for freely with your hand on a Kitsuma or with a 3 mil on an Air IL. This shock has low-speed rebound, low-speed compression, and high-speed compression externally.
Yeah.
The high-speed rebound is now a shim stack on the main piston. The reason we did that is on a twin tube shock, traditionally with the external high-speed rebound, there's a digressive curve, meaning that the faster you go, there's a slight decrease in damping force as the shock has, at a full bottom out, that's the most potential energy a shock's going to have. And so your high-speed rebound is keeping the shock from basically bouncing you off. On a traditional shock, like a traditional twin tube shock, the force is actually a little lower right at the end of stroke. And we wanted to adjust that. So the high-speed rebound on the main piston allows us to have a linear rebound curve. So the faster you go, the more damping there is. And we figured that was going to be important when you add a lot of end stroke force, right? So that was the reason for doing that. However, if people need more high-speed rebound, it is something that can be tuned at a service center. And I know that the service centers are going to be stoked to do some custom tuning for folks that are nerds about that. But of course, we've done our homework on the range of rebound. And we know that there's a finite amount of springs out there, right? So traditionally, we carry 350 to 650 spring rates. So we tuned the shock to use that range of springs and make sure that the rebound curve is good for both. So
does that apply to rebound and compression? So riders, well, 350 on my bikes is like a 65 kilogram rider, depending on the model, but around a 65. I don't know what that is in pounds. And then 600 is like a 110 kilogram rider.
Okay.
So this shock will cover quite a large range of.
Yeah, and that's what we've been known for, right? Like all of our shocks, that the damping should not be something that holds people back in terms of its capability. If you're to your point, for those folks in America, 65 times 2.2, so 140 to 240 pound rider weights are going to be totally fine to be ridden on the same bike with the same shock. Yeah, just brilliant. Of course having a different spring rate.
Yeah, different spring. Okay. Yeah, well, that's really good. I think that's enough. My head's hurting a little bit. I think call it a day. But yeah, if you got anything else to add, or I know one of your people at Cane Creek, Wheeler's got a Starling, and he's been running this Tigon shock on it and loving it. So it's good. I think he was pretty excited, wasn't he? He was,
he definitely he bought the bike. He's had probably 3 different Cane Creek shocks on it now at this point. We lent him a Tigon and he won't give it back. So I think that's a good sign. Yeah.
Excellent. Okay. Well, that's brilliant. Yeah. Thank you for that. And it's been good to chat. And I've learned lots actually. It's been interesting. But
I guess the only thing to add too, and I'm personally proud of this, is that we were able to incorporate that 3mm Allen wrench with a magnet.
I did
the shock. That's my favorite thing, man. Like I've used it to like adjust my derailleur. There's been points where I need a 3mm for something random and it's on the shock and it's magnetized to it. So that is the coolest thing in my opinion. Of course there's detents on the shock too for like when you feel your low speed adjusters clicking. There's also a hole in your high speed compression knob, which is a tool-free adjuster. But if it's kind of hard to turn, you can actually stick the Allen key into the hole there and you can adjust. And that's the low speed compression that you've got it connected to. And then the knob that twists on the outside of that has holes on either end of it too, right? So you can actually, so if you wanted to just use that as a visual, sometimes a bike, you can actually use your Allen wrench to kind of measure like a quarter turn doing it this way, right? So a little bit more precise there.
Okay. Can you give us some base settings for these shocks?
Sure.
That'd be useful.
Yeah, I mean, I always run my stuff at mid-tune to start with, right? Yeah. Typically, there's preferences. People like to ride unsupported for a little while, meaning run no damping at all and then add clicks as you feel comfortable. Of course, when you run rebound as fast as it can possibly go, the shock can react to the trail most fluidly. So if you want it to feel like a carpet, of course, running the very minimal amount of rebound is going to be the starting point. But as soon as you hit a jump and the thing wants to buck you forward, then that's when you want to start adding damping, right? So it's a preference. I typically run a little more damping as I'm a dirt jumper, so I have more of a dirt jump background, and I don't like my shock to be super responsive. So I typically start in the middle, and then I either add more or less. Of course, low speed compression is going to be something that people would probably use quicker. Rebound is one of those things that you kind of set it and forget it.
Yeah.
To me, low speed compression is the thing I adjust most often when I'm riding different trails.
So what do you think about, I always advise to people to find even just 100 yards of trail that they know and has got a selection of things, and just keep riding it and change your setting, ride it again, change your setting. You can't, it's very difficult to people to recommend you settings until you know in your head what that change actually does and how it affects it. So
yeah, exactly. And that's I'm really happy to hear that you're telling people that, because that's definitely the way to do it. And especially with doing one adjustment at a time, I think that's really important. You know, if you add 3 clicks of low speed compression and then you reduce 3 clicks of low speed rebound, then what do you really know is happening? So definitely do one at a time. In the past, we've had shocks that have like 30 clicks of low speed compression, and it can be kind of overwhelming. And I would traditionally tell people to say, like, turn it 3 or 5 clicks. And if you feel a difference, then that gives you confidence to make an adjustment either back or more. And you know that it's making a discernible difference. On a shock like this, we actually have increased the thread pitch on some of these needles so that fewer clicks will make more of a difference. So I would say that I would turn a low speed knob 2 clicks. And then to do a set of, you know, as you mentioned, 100 yards, and then go back up. If you felt like it was good, just for the hell of it, do 2 more and see if it's too much, right? So that's definitely the way to tune the shock. And of course, to your point earlier, right, like running a coil shock instead of an air shock for the stiction, you probably want the shock to be as freely moving as possible, meaning that someone, you know, of that type of riding style would probably be better off tuning from open, right? A lot of service centers will actually tune from closed. So they'll say, oh, I'm running -15. And that means that the shock, you bottom the shock out clockwise and you click back 15 clicks. I don't necessarily agree with that, just because certain shocks have a different damping range. Right?
I think that's more just people know how to close it, just because it's a natural thing, isn't it? To pull it around and then go back from it. It just feels. I think it's just a what's the word? Ergonomics type reason for doing it that way rather than anything else. And
now a mid tune's even harder than that, because you have to, like, you know, count how many clicks there is from 0 to full, and then click halfway back. Right now, when you buy a new Tigon or a new Kitsuma or an RIL from Cane Creek, all of our shocks are tuned at mid-tune, meaning we start the adjusters in the middle of the adjustment range. So maybe that's why I've just so instilled on starting at mid-tune. But I'm kind of a normal size guy too. So, like, you know, if the shock is capable of running damping for a 350-pound spring versus a 650, and I'm on a 500, mid-tune is a good starting point. So maybe we can add that too, Joe, is you know, the higher the spring rate, you probably are going to want more rebound damping. That's an example. Right? Just to start.
Brilliant. Okay, I think that's good. I think that's plenty for people to watch. But that's really interesting, and nice to chat to you. Hopefully, we'll meet up one day and go riding one day.
Yeah, man. Yeah, last time I was in the UK was like 4 years ago for Core Bike, January 2020, and then the whole world shut down. But I rode with all the guys at TF Tuned. We went to Bike Park Wales, and it was super cool to have some culture shock.
I'm actually visiting them tomorrow, actually, to set up a special bike I can't talk about, but
good. Well, say hi to the boys for me.
We'll do. Brilliant. Okay. All right. Nice to speak to you.
Absolutely.
Cheers,
you guys have a good day.
Okay.